Good day. I've spent decades studying economic cycles, historical patterns, and the intricate dance of global powers. Yet, the convergence of events we're witnessing now is unlike anything I've encountered before. It's not just about tariffs or political shifts. It's about the underlying forces reshaping our world. We are now at a point in time where multiple, powerful forces are converging in ways that are both deeply concerning and historically significant. This convergence is not something you can view in isolation. It's a dynamic interplay between economic, social, and geopolitical shifts that are shaping the future in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. I've studied long-term cycles for decades, and when you begin to see these patterns align, it becomes clear that we are entering a period of exceptional transformation, possibly upheaval. First, there's the economic side. We're in the later stages of a long-term debt cycle. Debt levels, both public and private, have reached extremes that are no longer sustainable without major consequences. Central banks are caught between a rock and a hard place. They can't raise interest rates without triggering defaults, and they can't keep printing money without devaluing the currency and feeding inflation. It's a classic trap, and historically, it's the kind of trap that precedes big shifts in economic power. At the same time, we're seeing internal divisions within countries, particularly in the U.S., widen to dangerous levels. The gap between the rich and the poor, between educated and uneducated, between left and right. It's grown so large that it's threatening the very cohesion that a society needs to function. And when that cohesion breaks down, history tells us you get conflict, sometimes violent conflict. People lose faith in institutions, and when that happens, they look for more extreme solutions. That's the path societies take when they feel the system no longer works for them. Then there's the global order, which is shifting dramatically. The rise of China and the relative decline of the U.S. as a global superpower is changing the balance of power. That transition is always messy, and it often leads to conflict, especially when both sides feel threatened. The existing global order was built in a different era, and it no longer reflects the realities of today's world. These kinds of shifts historically occur once in a lifetime, sometimes once in a few generations. And when they do, they're usually accompanied by significant stress, both economically and politically. The key point here is that these forces aren't isolated. They're happening simultaneously. That makes them exponentially more impactful. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're going to be caught off guard. If you study history objectively and in depth, without emotional attachment to the present, you begin to see that patterns repeat. The events we're experiencing now may feel new because they're happening to us in real time, but they've happened many times before in different forms. Human nature doesn't change much. The ways people respond to rising debt, internal conflict, inflation, wealth gaps, and power transitions are remarkably consistent across time. When you zoom out and look at the long arc of history, especially over the last 500 years, you start to see a cycle of rising and declining empires. Empires typically rise when they build strong education systems, productive economies, sound finances, and foster innovation. They peak when they become the dominant players in trade, finance, and military strength. But then, over time, complacency sets in. Debt levels rise, internal conflict emerges, and the cost of maintaining the empire starts to exceed its capacity. That's when the decline begins. We've seen this with the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, and now we're watching the same elements unfold in the American case. These transitions tend to follow a recognizable sequence. First, There's a strong economic expansion and a period of peace and prosperity. Then comes over-indebtedness, often due to growing entitlements and a reliance on credit-fueled growth. After that, central banks are pressured to print money, which leads to currency debasement. Inflation rises, living standards fall for the majority, and populist movements gain momentum. Eventually, you see increasing conflict, social, political, and even international, as trust in institutions breaks down. What's critical to understand is that these shifts don't happen all at once. They unfold over years, even decades, and most people only recognize them in hindsight. But they are happening right now. If you study the late stages of past empires, you'll see eerie similarities. Internal fragmentation, rising populism, a loss of common truth, unsustainable debt levels, and the erosion of the currency's value. It's not about predicting the future. It's about recognizing where we are in the cycle. And if we don't learn from the past, if we fail to see the rhyme in the pattern, we're likely to repeat the same costly mistakes. History isn't a straight line, it's a loop, and we're in a very familiar part of it right now. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is that economic systems are robust by design, that they can handle shocks, adapt quickly, and self-correct. But what I've found over decades of studying markets, countries, and historical cycles is that economic systems are far more fragile than they appear, and that fragility often stems from a combination of short-term thinking, structural imbalances, and an over-reliance on tools that no longer work the way they used to. Right now, we're seeing the consequences of years, decades, of policies that prioritized quick fixes over structural reform. We've built an economy that's heavily dependent on debt, not just government debt, but corporate debt, consumer debt. It's embedded in everything. That kind of leverage creates a superficial sense of strength, like a building propped up by temporary scaffolding. It looks stable until pressure hits, and when it does, things fall fast. The central banks, especially in the developed world, have been using interest rate manipulation and money printing as their go-to tools. Those tools worked when inflation was low and trust in the system was high. But now the situation is different. With inflationary pressures rising and fiscal deficits exploding, those levers have lost their effectiveness. Lowering interest rates doesn't stimulate the same kind of growth anymore, and printing money risks further debasing the currency. We're reaching a point where the old playbook isn't just ineffective, it's dangerous. Add to that our increasing reliance on global supply chains, particularly with countries that are geopolitical rivals. For decades, it's been cheaper to outsource production, import goods, and depend on foreign labor. That made economic sense until the system was tested, and we've now seen how quickly those supply chains can be disrupted. Whether it's a pandemic, a war, or just rising political tensions, the vulnerabilities are there. We've traded resilience for efficiency, and now the bill is coming due. What's critical to understand is that this kind of fragility doesn't show up on a day-to-day basis. It builds slowly. Then something happens, an interest rate shock, a geopolitical event, a loss of confidence, and suddenly everything looks different. That's the nature of tipping points. Economic fragility isn't obvious until it's too late to respond without pain. That's why the time to recognize and address it is now, not after the cracks become breaks. What's happening beneath the surface of our political and social systems is deeply troubling, and most people either don't see it or choose to ignore it. But if you've studied the cycles of history, particularly the decline of once dominant nations, you'll recognize that one of the most consistent warning signs is the erosion of democratic institutions. It doesn't usually happen in a sudden collapse. It's gradual. It's the slow loss of trust, the decay of norms, the polarization that turns disagreement into hatred. Democracies are built on a few core principles: rule of law, respect for institutions, peaceful transitions of power, and the ability to compromise. When those principles are undermined, the system starts to break down from within. And right now, we're seeing exactly that. The growing divide between the left and the right isn't just ideological, it's structural. People are no longer operating from a shared set of facts. They're living in separate realities, driven by different sources of information, different fears, and different visions for what their country should be. That kind of fragmentation is incredibly dangerous. The root of much of this is economics, specifically the widening wealth and opportunity gaps. When large segments of the population feel like the system is rigged against them, they lose faith in that system. And once faith is lost, people become open to more extreme options. That's how democracies tilt toward authoritarianism, not through a sudden coup, but through gradual disillusionment that erodes the foundations of participation and accountability. We're also seeing institutions, courts, legislatures, media, become battlegrounds rather than stabilizers. When institutions are no longer perceived as impartial or fair, their legitimacy crumbles. And when that legitimacy goes, so does their ability to function. History shows us that once institutions break down, power shifts from rules to personalities and from reasoned debate to raw conflict. That's when societies become ungovernable. The other thing to note is that polarization tends to accelerate itself. Each side, feeling threatened, pushes harder. That invites an equal and opposite reaction. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing until compromise is no longer even considered a virtue. It's seen as weakness. And when you reach that point, you're no longer debating policy, you're fighting for survival. If you care about the future, you can't afford to ignore this erosion. It's happening. And if we don't find a way to reverse it, through economic fairness, shared purpose, and institutional renewal, the consequences will be severe. What becomes clear when you step back and look at the big picture, across economic, social, and geopolitical dimensions, is that the current trajectory is unsustainable. Systems, like anything else, have natural limits. When those limits are exceeded, when debt gets too high, when gaps get too wide, when trust breaks down, something has to give. What we need urgently is a strategic rebalancing, and that doesn't mean a tweak here and there. It means fundamental realignment across multiple dimensions of the economy and society. On the economic side, we have to shift from a consumption-driven, debt-financed model toward one that is more productivity-based. Right now, too much of our growth is artificial. It's borrowed from the future. That might provide temporary relief, but it doesn't create lasting prosperity. Real wealth comes from productivity, producing more and better goods and services, innovating, educating, investing in infrastructure and people. Those are the foundations of sustainable growth. Without them, you're just inflating numbers with credit. We also have to deal with our fiscal imbalances, running massive deficits year after year and funding them through money creation may feel like a solution, but it leads to inflation, currency debasement, and eventually a loss of confidence. That's the tipping point we need to avoid. Rebalancing requires making hard choices, reducing spending, increasing revenues, or ideally both. in a way that spreads the burden fairly. That's not easy. It's politically difficult. But the alternative is far worse. Then there's the internal cohesion of the country. We can't continue down a path where people feel like they're living in two different nations. The polarization, the inequality, the lack of shared opportunity, it all feeds instability. We need to invest in rebuilding the middle ground. That means education reform, equal access to opportunity, and restoring the idea that progress is possible for everyone, not just the top tier. Without that, you're not just dealing with an economic problem, you're facing a societal fracture. And globally, we need to adapt to a world where power is more multipolar. The unipolar moment is over. Strategic rebalancing means cooperating where we can, competing where we must, and preparing for a world that looks very different from the one we grew up in. This isn't about ideology. It's about survival. The system is flashing warning signs. The sooner we rebalance, the better chance we have of avoiding a hard landing.